Yes, here's the Quran by Mevlana Sadr-ud-Din. I'm going to discuss. Note the date 1939. It was supposed to be lost. And I traced a copy together with the National Library in Berlin, Staatsbibliothek. And it's now restored there in the rare manuscripts room. Why it was supposed to be lost is part of this story. Next slide. First, I want to recall the time and place in which this Quran was first thought up. This was shortly after the Second World War. That was after Germany and Turkey had gone into a weapon brotherhood and had waged a so-called jihad against the British, and they lost. By 1918, it was forbidden to them to communicate. And east of Germany, meanwhile, the Russian Empire broke apart and a revolution happened. And after that revolution, very many countries between Germany and Soviet Russia tried to become independent. Of those, only Finland and Poland succeeded, and they are important in this story because this was the hour of Polish and Finnish Tatars. And on the other side of Soviet Russia were the Tatars trying to come to terms with the communists and at the same time speaking up, gaining voice in a new setting. Next slide. Well, in Berlin, nothing much changed for the moment. The Muslim key actors were, as before, Hafiz Shukri Bey, the Imam of the Ottoman Embassy, and Alimjan Idris from Orenburg, Imam of the nearby Tatar Pau camp, 18,000 Tatars. For the next 6 years, they ruled Muslim life in Berlin, and there were very many Muslims there because of that war. Next slide. And this was until the year 1924, when in March, the Caliphate in Istanbul was abolished. Now, this was a shock. And Hafiz Shukri Bey did not recover from this. He had a heart attack at Bahnhof, and he died 3 days later. And within this void, because that was the void, Alimjan Idris, the Tatar Imam, he founded a religious organization together with the Muslim ambassadors in Berlin, so as to grip the power that was formerly with Shukri Bey. Egyptians didn't like this. Egyptians and Palestinians and Syrians took to the street and protested and had a vicious fight with the Tatars. They also disrupted the stone-laying ceremony of the Ahmadiyya mosque, because meanwhile, Lahore Ahmadiyya had arrived and was starting construction work near the center of Berlin. Next slide. So that was all, there was a lot of chaos, and within this chaos, for half a year, from March 1924 until October, Tatar intellectuals deliberated about Quran translations with the Ahmadiyya missionary Sadr-ud-Din. They met in his apartment, but I think because they had been there all the time, they took him up between them.
Okay.
Yes, no, we want to have these photographs, and I explain. The one who describes this is Zeki Velidi Togan, the historian and philologist who was at Berlin University. Aarsenbeuren, Zinatola Aarsenbeuren came from Helsinki with the teacher Pinomov to discuss their Quran, which appeared 1942 and can be traced to Helsinki University Library. Jakub Sienkiewicz, the Polish Tatar, he was then writing his dissertation on Turkish philology in Berlin, and he also started a translation, a Polish Qur'an that appeared 1935. Alimjan Idrisi here, I think he governed the proceedings. He called himself then religious leader of Muslim Berlin. He pulled the strings, I'd say, and he also invited Hasan Takizadeh, a Persian who had set up a Muslim Democratic Party for Persia, but because Persia didn't want him working from Berlin. And there was Molvi Sadr-ud-Din, new in Berlin, hardly speaking any German. The gentleman conversed in Farsi. And the idea of making his own Quran was born there. Next slide. So this one was missing from the deliberations. Musa Charula, he was in Berlin. This is what Togan says. And he was very warm with the Ahmadiyya Mosque. Later, when he came 32, he taught to children and converts. He was on the preacher list, just as Idrisi was always on the preacher list of the Ahmadiyya Mosque. And there were warm contacts between Polish Tatars and Woking, and Finnish Tatars and Woking. And there was a coming and going in this Lahore Ahmadiyya Mosque in Berlin. Next slide. So what did I talk about? Togan says the necessity of a unified transliteration for Europe, the use of Latin alphabet or not. Are we talking about literal descriptions in Quran stories, or are these allegories? And some of those present wanted to speak about the Quran as a text, historical text in a historical late antiquity context. Now you can see that quite some historians and philologists were at work here. How this finished, I don't know, because Togan does not speak about it, but what I know is what Sadr-ud-Din did with this. Next slide. Summing up, before we move to the Quran, what did Tatar and Ahmadiyya intellectuals in that time have as a common basis? To put it very short, I think Poles and Finns had their moment of becoming visible in their new nation states. They wanted to gain voice as a cultural minority. Now, this is what Ahmadiyya stood for. They had already gained voice as a religious minority in India, in British India, 92. This is one reason why many Muslims were against them at that time. They treated them as traitors, because this was a kind of cooperating with the British colonizer for them. But this is where they were looking for a place as a minority. And then Quran translation for Finns and Tatars was a means to gain voice and a face and become visible as a religious minority in their new countries. And Ahmadiyya interests were a bit different there, because as long as they had been facing the British colonizer, they did not look for places where they could agree with one another, but a translation as a means to disprove British superiority, to push back the British missionaries. So this is, to my mind, where they differed. The first ones were looking for interconnectedness in their countries, and the Ahmadiyya so far had been looking for ways to morally delegitimize their British other. Next slide. So what did he do, Sadr-ud-Din? I'm going through text history, then look at his commentary, and then have a look at the introduction. Next slide. So text history fits in one slide. A year later already, he returns to Lahore with scant knowledge of the German language and society. I've read his letters. There's enough German there to have a conversation, but to write a German text, let alone translate such an important document, it's not enough. And 2 years in Germany to understand the Germans is too little. He knows that. So he first asks his German converts, do they want to come, especially a man called Hugo Marcus. But these converts, they have just converted. They are still busy in making sense of what this is all about. And going to India and sitting there for 2 years or 4 years to do a translation, everybody says no. So in the end, Dr. Met Mansour, he has just written his dissertation in medicine in Berlin, and he is setting up a praxis. He joins Sadr-ud-Din in Lahore to help him with the German language. 2 years. And in 1937, Sadr-ud-Din returns to Berlin, that's 12 years later, to discuss the translation, it's ready, with Hugo Marcus, his German collaborator all the time. But Hugo Marcus, as we will see in a minute, is more busy with the Berlin community than what happens in Lahore. And together they sit down for half a year, and together they develop guiding lines for the commentary. Sadr-ud-Din says in the preface that he, in the course of this work, he had to change the translation as to fit the key terms of the commentary. Now, this was serious, and we will see in a minute how serious this was. So he goes again. He goes in October, he leaves, he takes his leave, goes back to Lahore, and Hugo Marcus sits down for 2 years, works out all the details and writes the introduction. In fact, he writes the commentary, as we will see. And in 1938, the mosque publishes 2 pages as a sort of preview of what they are doing. Now, this is immediately noted in Singapore and discussed in Genuine Islam, the mission magazine there. And the writer says, this is not Sadr-ud-Din, this is Hugo Marcus. And what happens with the language of the Qur'an is something you can't understand. Something happening there, something queer. This again is noted in Berlin by Muslims who are more Al-Azhar minded and fighting the Ahmadiyya by that time. And they write to the Foreign Office and say, there's this Jew, Hugo Marcus, and he's doing this Quran translation and he is corrupting the German language. Could you please stop that? The Foreign Office doesn't, and Nazi government doesn't, no steps. And in 1939, in June, this Quran appears in Berlin. It's printed in Berlin and it's spread first in Berlin and then in Germany. And two months later already, the war begins. And very many packages are then ordered by the German army and sent to the front. Because indeed, the Germans love Islam, but they have their very own notion for it. And that is the different one as the Ahmadiyya has. So next slide. I want to sum up in between. What happens there? So in Lahore, there are 2 presidents, Muhammad Ali and Sadr-ud-Din. They're sitting together in the same office. One has already done a famous Quran translation. The other one is working on a Quran translation. They will have talked about it. And they will have decided that addressing the Germans is something totally different than addressing the English oppressor. Germans are interested in Islam, but in the time that Lahore Ahmadiyya is in Berlin, those then 7 years, big changes are at the horizon. And by the time that Sadr-ud-Din comes back to Berlin, this is not the avant-garde, young public anymore that wants to experience with all kinds of religions, but these are staunch nationalists that are coursing towards war. And in their swing, think that Islam is a very handy religion, a jihad religion. So what do? They trust their German collaborators. The next slide. Yes, here they are. Photograph made on the day that the convert society, the Deutsch-Muslimische Gesellschaft, was founded. 4 converts, 3 Ahmadis. We see Dr. Mansour, he's back by then. He won't have, I don't hear him in the years after of cooperating with Hugo Marcus. Abdullah, a very young man of 1900, is keeping up the Ahmadiyya flag. He must take care that Ahmadiyya thought is not corrupted. And in the middle, you see Hugo Marcus. He is a philosopher, a Nietzschean, a Wagnerian, conservative. He is known as a publicist in Berlin. He's a homosexual, an open one. That's why I say this, because he writes at the same time for homosexual magazines. He has a certain idea of maleness. He converts to Islam 1923. He's the flagship of this community. He is the thinker. I found in his archive in Basel, now in Zurich, 51 unpublished texts on Islam. I read them all. They make difficult reading because this is conservative, very strung up German. But all the same, Ahmadis in Lahore trusted Hugo Marcus to be the one to find the right words to reach out to the Germans. And this was quicksand. They didn't know anymore who was who and what was being done. So they trusted Hugo Marcus. And when they sat together in 1937, they gave him the responsibility to find the keywords. And even the Qur'an was redirected. The wording of the German Qur'an was redirected according to Hugo Marcus' ideas. Now, what did come out of this? Next slide. Yes, I only have 4 examples, but I could do 100. The first one is Muhammad Ali takes this place to say every Muslim must accept earlier prophets. Hugo Marcus says something totally different. The prophet is an ideal man, and the ideal Führer, the word comes in the commentary. And if I look at Marcus' unpublished texts, I have only mentioned 1. I can mention 6 or 7 to you because I have written a lot about the prophet. Muhammad, as a knower of the human condition, is sometimes word by word quoted in that commentary. The second place I looked is the introduction to Maryam. Muhammad Ali uses this place to say things, very basic things about the nature of Jesus. Then goes on, as you know, to set right the birth of Jesus. Marcus does none of that. He has this very crummy word. I think this is what was seen in Singapore, the word Ritterlichkeit, a German word which is can be translated into chivalry. He goes on to on and on about the prophet and the prophet who has chivalry. Now, Marcus made the text chivalry in Islam. It's about a certain male image. My third example was the Zinat verse, which Muhammad Ali uses to say there's no verse in the Quran that obliges women to cover their heads. Marcus has none of that and says women must obey and serve man, a very conservative idea of gender. And this is, again, I can trace it back to this little text, What Does the Quran Tell Us, which is all about women and their place. And the fourth surah I took is one of the jihad surah, which for Muhammad Ali, of course, is spreading the belief with words and keep on talking against all odds. Convince people through writing and talking. And Marcus uses this place to say martyrium. He uses the Christian word. Martyrium is great merit, meaning he finds it in between position between those Germans who say, enthusiastically say, Islam is jihad and that is war. And that is comes in very handy for us. He has an in-between position and says, well, those who fight can also be martyrs, and that belongs to jihad. And this can be traced back to, for instance, the text, the idea of heroes in Islam. Now, if this is going to be a written text, I can do more quotes, but I think as an example, it is enough. We go on to the introduction. The introduction, under which Sadr-ud-Din writes his name, because after this hassle of 1938, where Egyptian Muslims have written to the Foreign Office, hey, there is a Jew there who is corrupting the German language, Lahore decides to withdraw Marcus' name from all the papers. His name does not figure in neither in the preface, not in the introduction. So this is what Sadr-ud-Din purportedly says. This is Ahmadiyya thinking. It starts out like this. Quran completes earlier revelations. The concept of Trinity is wrong. All earlier prophets prepared for the prophet. The Quran corrects the biblical narrations. All fine there. And then comes the Quran owes to previous holy texts. It is in the introduction called Foreign Sources in Islam, and it is verbatim, word for word, the text of Hugo Marcus, interfaces between Quran and non-Islamic religious sources. And he talks about historical raw materials, and he lines up, he numbers them, Jewish sources, New Testament, Zoroastrian, Egyptian sources. Very interesting, and also very interesting that he saw all that, but next slide, now a conflict explodes. January 1940, this Quran finally arrives in Lahore. And when Sadr-ud-Din reads this, he says, that's not me, I haven't written that. There is a correspondence of 20 letters in Hugo Marcus' archive in Zurich that traces, you can trace this conflict step by step. The community is angry. Sadr-ud-Din doesn't want to have anything to do with it. Abdullah, who has then returned to Lahore, is said to set things straight, and he instructs Marcus, who is in Basel, who then instructs the community in Berlin to withdraw all the sold copies, to rip out the pages, and to put new pages with plaster in the already printed Quran. This goes on and on. It's very much work for the community to do. This is full wartime. And letters come through in a very difficult manner. But Lahore says, if you don't do it, we stop money. So they do it. And then on those 6,000 copies they have in Berlin, a firebomb explodes and all the copies burn. And after that, they have said until today, no copies of that. Doesn't exist anymore. And I don't know whether I did right. I found one. And this is how I could tell you this story. One more slide. So conclusions. My first conclusion is, well, this is a major transcultural cooperation between Germany and India. If you look at what happened in that time, dance, music, architecture, intellectual projects, this is one of the most difficult and hazardous, big project on a very big distance. And the starting point was extensive exchange with European Tatars. And those Tatars were on and on in the mosque. They were always there. And they had a common aim of gaining voice as a religious minority in Europe. But if you look at shifting partnerships, where in the beginning it was Tatars and later it was the Germans, the German converts themselves, all those language difficulties, the difficult political and cultural contexts, which are so hard to look into, and also different cultural expectations from both sides and projections. What in Lahore was thought about the Germans and how they could set things straight. Well, it's up to you to judge whether that was right or not, but that it was difficult. It was a hazard. Okay, the next slide. They managed, and out came a Qur'an that was totally different than Muhammad Ali's translation. I've opened up everywhere, and it is quoted nowhere. As you know, if you look in Muhammad Ali's translation, a great deal of those commentaries quote a biblical text because he wants to refute what went before. He wants to say this is corrupt, and lucky for Christians that Islam came and validated that. So there's also no sign of disproving or delegitimizing Christianity, probably because they decided, well, that won't do with the Germans, they're somewhere else. And what they tried to do was a novel attempt at explaining the Quran to a German public. Now, this is about bridging, about translation as transfer, as I heard this morning. And the question is, how far can you go? Next slide. This is what they did in the end, or this is what the German collaborators did. They have put the prophet in Hitler's stead. It's very clear in the wording. This is about the ideal man, who is the prophet, and the man of the future, who is being made at that moment by the Nazis, who is going to be like the prophet. And advertising an ideal of man and writing out an ideal of woman that comes close to Nazi ideals. Okay, this is my end. Thank you. Last. Yes. Yeah, thank you.